In '87, there was still a prospect that the Single European Act might benefit the United Kingdom, but it became gradually clear that it was not doing so. And I think then that caused me, and I suspect Margaret Thatcher too, ask ourselves some of the questions which Enoch Powell had raised much earlier. And I remember now so clearly Enoch observing that the European Union could never be a democratic system.
Mrs. Thatcher's alarm grew when Jacques Delors made a provocative visit to the Trades Union Congress, fraternizing with her sworn enemies. She and Labour realized from this moment that Europe was a way of undoing Thatcherism by the back door. That discovery turned her into a Eurosceptic and swung Labour towards Euro enthusiasm.
The Labour Party were receiving the message from Europe. You can have back all the trades union rights which Norman Tebbit robbed you of in his legislation. Human rights legislation, social chapter from Europe, and it doesn't matter if you lose the election, the Tories will never be able to put it back. So they flipped.
My antagonism towards membership of the community had been one of the biggest areas of my life, and a different course had to be argued for. Happily, I was far from alone in the Labour Party.
It is necessary to work together. Dear friends, your movement has a major role to play. Europe needs you. Thank you.
Inspired by Delors, Labour rapidly transformed itself into a fervently pro-European party, which it has been ever since. Hearing the Delors speech, Mrs. Thatcher abandoned a holiday in Cornwall and crafted her response. Now, the sceptics, outsiders for so long, at last had an ally in the centre of British politics. Her speech in the ancient Belgian city of Bruges would be a decisive moment.
Mr. Chairman, you have invited me to speak on the subject of Britain and Europe. If you believe some of the things said and written about my views on Europe, it must seem rather like inviting Genghis Khan to speak on the virtues of peaceful coexistence.
The Bruges speech was almost like Martin Luther nailing his theses to the door of the church. Thus far and no further. She had decided the moment had come to try to set a different course in Europe. Now, you can argue perhaps she was too late. Maybe the tide had come in too far and she was struggling against it.
We have not successfully rolled back the frontiers of the state in Britain, only to see them reimposed at a European level, with a European superstate exercising a new dominance from Brussels.
It becomes clear that Margaret Thatcher, although she's Prime Minister, although she's leader of the Conservative Party, is also going to be the leader of the Eurosceptic faction. And of course, her standing was very, very high. And where she led, people followed.
I think that she could have united the Conservative Party round a broadly Eurosceptic position, not Europhobic at all, but Eurosceptic position, had she played it rather differently. In fact, the party became very divided.
The divisions were sharper because she had thwarted the ambitions of so many senior colleagues. She was isolated and exhausted. But her scepticism spurred others on. Anti-Brussels groups emerged around her. One was pointedly named after the Bruges speech.
Maggie went to Bruges, made her famous Bruges speech, and thereafter a group of us set up the Bruges group. I became its kind of leading spokesman and pamphleteer. We all got together at the Reform Club. It was set up as a non-party group, although it was very largely conservative. It was converting the Tory party from being the major Europhile party into being the major Eurosceptic one.
One reason for the Tory Euro revolution was that the Thatcher economic miracle was running into trouble. After the boom of the 80s came the bust of the early 90s. But worse would be the exchange rate mechanism, a first step towards merging the currencies of Europe.
We have applied this weekend to join the exchange rate mechanism.
It remains one of the great paradoxes of modern British history that Margaret Thatcher, of all people, should have been Prime Minister when Britain took the fateful step of joining the ERM.
We are in a position to apply for the exchange rate mechanism, which at the same time will underpin our anti-inflationary stance.
John Major and Geoffrey Howe got together and really twisted Margaret Thatcher's arm to make her enter the exchange rate mechanism. And that left the party rather bewildered. They could not understand how the Prime Minister, who had opposed it so vehemently, suddenly found herself in the exchange rate mechanism. And by the way, what a howling disaster it was.
An utter disaster. She now faced an inexorable timetable which would take Britain further towards absorption in united Europe.
Now, with regard to some of
The closer she was to her doom, the more sceptical she became.
The President of the Commission, Mr. Delors, said at press conference the other day that he wanted the European Parliament to be the democratic body of the community, he wanted the Commission to be the executive, and he wanted the Council of Ministers to be the Senate. No, no, no.
I believe that's probably about the time that the plots began. Plot number one was to force the Prime Minister into the exchange rate mechanism, whether she wanted it or whether she didn't. And plot number two, which evolved over a long period of time, was to get rid of the Prime Minister herself. And there's no doubt at all that Europe was fundamentally important to many of those members of the Cabinet who were responsible for getting rid of her in 1990.
Only weeks later, she was gone. The European issue destroyed Mrs. Thatcher, but her successor, John Major, proclaimed that he wished to be where we belong, at the very heart of Europe.
We knew that the people who were taking over, with Heseltine as Deputy Prime Minister and others in the government, that this was not a Eurosceptic government. Heseltine was a mad pro-European, and he later on gave an interview saying one day Britain would disappear from national memory.
Very quickly, John Major got what he desired, and a good deal more. Ever closer union was still on the agenda. Despite friendly smiles, the other European leaders were already on the road to Maastricht. Major thought his opt-outs from the treaty were what mattered. Actually, it was the things he couldn't opt out of that counted more. Maastricht would undermine most of what Tory Britain held dear, yet Major rammed it ruthlessly through Parliament.
There is in this treaty a great deal that we have sought in this country for some years. The recognition of intergovernmental cooperation, subsidiarity, the reinforced rule of law which we sought, cooperation on justice and home affairs, improved foreign policy coordination, and stronger budget discipline.
Maastricht was the second of two great blows aimed at British national independence and sovereignty. But unlike the first, the Single European Act, Maastricht was quite openly a plan for accelerating political and economic union. In 1992, John Major was re-elected, just. But his hopes of an easy passage for the Maastricht Treaty were suddenly derailed. Having lashed his reputation to the ERM, he could not bring himself to quit it when danger threatened.
There are going to be no devaluations, no leaving the ERM. We are absolutely committed to the ERM. That is our policy.
The city quickly told a different story as the economic facts of life asserted themselves. Homebound commuters were bemused as they saw interest rates rise 3 whole points in one day.
Today has been an extremely difficult and turbulent day. Massive speculative flows have continued to disrupt the functioning of the exchange rate mechanism, that Britain's best interests are served by suspending our membership of the exchange rate mechanism.
The Treasury's doomed, unhinged attempt to keep Britain in the ERM cost £3.3 billion, justly described at the time as the equivalent of chucking several modern hospitals into the sea. This not only destroyed forever the Tory party's reputation for economic competence, it put new fire into the bellies of all Eurosceptics. Here was evidence that Europe, long touted as our salvation, was dangerous to our economy as well as to our independence.